I've always believed in the power of community, in the capacity of ordinary neighbors banding together to face crises head-on. That belief guided me through my years in disaster relief and emergency logistics, culminating in my position as a chief of emergency logistics at FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. I oversaw supply chains, organized shelters, and ensured that vital resources reached people devastated by natural catastrophes. Little did I know that my new home in Willow Creek Ridge, a picturesque suburban enclave in the American Midwest, would test that belief in the strangest way imaginable. It wasn't an earth-shattering earthquake, a roaring tornado, or even the unprecedented flood that truly challenged my resolve. It was the obstruction and sabotage by one individual, Miranda Karen Montclair. Karen was a mid-50s woman who carried herself with the imperious air of an ancient monarch. She wasn't merely part of the local HOA. She was the local HOA, to such an extent that no one dared challenge her. She ruled with fines, invasive inspections, and meddling that overshadowed every detail of neighborhood life. From the moment I set foot in Willow Creek Ridge, I felt her looming presence like a thundercloud promising a storm. I had no inkling that she would go so far as to jeopardize thousands of lives when the region faced catastrophic flooding, and that my own professional background would be the key to stopping her. This is the story of how a single malignant force tried to thwart a community's efforts to survive and recover, and how we exposed her for who she truly was, ending in a punishment harsher than any petty fine she had ever issued. The first time I laid eyes on Willow Creek Ridge, I was taken by its gentle hills, manicured lawns, and rows of tidy single-family homes. Elegant maples lined the streets, painting the neighborhood in bright greens and golds depending on the season. It all appeared idyllic, a perfect American suburb. My spouse, Amanda, and I had just purchased a modest two-story home on Mariners Court, a quiet cul-de-sac where families strolled in the evenings and kids rode bicycles up and down the sidewalk. The property had a beautiful oak tree in the front yard, a wide porch, and a backyard that overlooked a patch of wetlands bordering the creek. It was meant to be our peaceful retreat from the stress I regularly endured coordinating national emergency logistics. We envisioned calm weekends, light yard work, and friendly neighbors who waved hello. On moving day, we were barely an hour into unloading our truck when a charcoal gray Mercedes SUV cruised up. Out stepped a woman with coiffed blonde hair, wearing a crisp navy blazer and holding a leather-bound folder. Her expression was a curious mix of stern disapproval and forced politeness. She approached, extended a neatly manicured hand, and introduced herself. "Good morning. I'm Miranda Montclair, but you can call me Karen. It's a nickname I've embraced. I serve as president, treasurer, and oversight committee chair of the Willow Creek Ridge Homeowners Association." Amanda and I exchanged a glance, uneasy with the trifecta of titles. Karen continued, her sharp eyes flickering over the half-unloaded boxes and furniture on our driveway. "I just wanted to stop by and ensure you have a copy of the HOA guidelines. There are some immediate matters to address. The color of your porch swing doesn't match the community palette, and the moving truck is partially blocking the sidewalk. We have strict rules about both." Her tone contained no warmth. She then shoved a document at me, 30-plus pages detailing covenants, conditions, and restrictions. With a tight smile, Karen added, "I'll expect your signature confirming you've read and understood everything by the end of the week." We nodded awkwardly, though my internal alarm bells rang. Of course, we wanted to abide by reasonable neighborhood regulations. No one likes living next to a messy yard or blaring stereo. But Karen's approach radiated territorial aggression. Before I could gather my thoughts to respond, she pivoted on her heel and strode back to her Mercedes, leaving us with the printed rules of her little kingdom. Within days, we discovered that Karen's presence was inescapable. She circulated daily in her SUV, inspecting yards, driveways, and even glimpsing through fences if she could. A small team of compliance volunteers acted like her personal informants, noting any minor infractions: a stray trash bin on the curb an hour too early, a flower bed that included unapproved plant species, or a sidewalk chalk drawing left overnight by children. Residents would then receive politely threatening letters bearing Karen's signature. Around that time, I made acquaintances with a neighbor named John O'Malley, a kind, retired engineer with a penchant for tinkering in his garage workshop. He explained that Karen had consolidated power by intimidating or outmaneuvering any potential rivals within the HOA. People pay their fines or fix the issues just to avoid her wrath, John said wearily. I tried to run for an HOA board position once, but she basically used every rule in the book to disqualify me. It's not worth the stress. Amanda and I decided to tread carefully. I still had my job to manage, traveling frequently to coordinate FEMA logistical operations across the country. The last thing I wanted was to wage a domestic turf war with an overzealous HOA overlord. Still, in the back of my mind, I sensed that Karen's obsession with control was more than just an eccentric quirk. There was a raw arrogance behind her condescending smile, a hint of cruelty in her eyes. I had no idea how far that cruelty would go if challenged. Willow Creek Ridge, as the name suggested, was adjacent to a winding waterway known as Willow Creek. It meandered gently through farmland and suburbs before emptying into a larger river to the south. The wetlands behind our house were part of a local conservation effort. They were scenic, full of cattails, herons, and frogs that sang at dusk. When we first moved in, the creek seemed peaceful and benign. But as spring approached, I saw signs that concerned me. We had an unusually wet winter, and regional meteorologists warned of heavy rains. The ground was already saturated, and water levels in local rivers and creeks were rising. I'd studied enough hydrological models in my line of work to know that repeated storms could push these systems to their limits. Out of caution, I broached the possibility of flooding with some neighbors. John O'Malley recalled that a decade earlier, a severe storm had caused partial flooding, but the old drainage system had since been upgraded. No one seemed particularly worried, except me. The local government had begun quietly discussing the risk of a 100-year flood if the rains did not let up. I decided to do some discreet contingency planning. I made sure we had a stash of bottled water, sandbags, and essential supplies. I also checked if the community had an official flood response plan. One evening, I attended a neighborhood meeting, hoping to open a discussion about potential preparations. That was my first time seeing Karen in a formal setting, and it quickly became obvious how she quelled dissent. The Willow Creek Ridge HOA meeting took place in the local community center, a bright building with large windows and neat rows of chairs set up in a multipurpose room. Karen presided at the front table, flanked by two board members, both looking nervous, as if perpetually unsure whether they could speak freely. When I arrived, the room was already half full. People whispered among themselves about overdue fines, landscaping mandates, and potential new rules. The tension was palpable. Karen opened the session by going through a list of minor issues: compliance deadlines, upcoming Easter decorations, the color scheme for fences. The usual fare. Finally, they opened the floor for new business. I stood, introduced myself, and in a calm tone said, "As some of you know, I work in emergency logistics. Given the heavy rainfall and rising creek levels, it might be wise for us to discuss a flood preparedness plan. We might consider stocking sandbags, planning evacuation routes, and coordinating with local authorities if conditions worsen." The reaction was immediate. A few neighbors nodded in agreement, and some expressed relief that someone was bringing this up. But Karen's expression hardened. She fixed me with her gaze. "We appreciate your professional insight, but Willow Creek Ridge has never had a serious flood. We have well-maintained drainage and storm sewers. Start talking about floods, and you'll just scare people unnecessarily. Furthermore, large stockpiles of sandbags would be an eyesore and violate our guidelines for front lawn storage." I tried to clarify that we could store them discreetly or keep them in a communal supply area, but she waved me off, her voice dripping with condescension. "Please leave emergency management to the official county offices. The HOA is here to maintain property values, not to cause panic." Some neighbors were visibly uncomfortable with her dismissive attitude, but none dared to contradict her openly. I sat down, frustrated. In my mind, a spark of worry flared. Karen was effectively blocking prudent flood precautions. She might claim it was to prevent panic, but I suspected she feared losing her iron grip if an external entity, like local emergency services, told residents what to do. She wanted all matters to filter through her. That night, I told Amanda that we'd better keep preparing on our own. The storms on the weather radar looked too big to ignore. Several weeks later, a series of storms pummeled the region. Rain poured in torrents for days, saturating the soil until the creek banks groaned under the strain. By early May, local news stations flashed flood watches and warnings. The county recommended that at-risk areas, including portions of Willow Creek Ridge near the wetlands, prepare for evacuations. I was away on a brief work trip, coincidentally in another state that had just been through severe thunderstorms. While there, I received frantic calls from Amanda, describing how the creek had risen to the top of its banks. Streets near the water were already under 6 inches of water. Some yards had become small lakes. She and John O'Malley placed sandbags around our back door to stave off encroaching water. Despite the visible threat, Karen remained obstinate. She circulated an email insisting the situation was under control and advising residents not to take unnecessary, unsightly measures, like piling sandbags in open view. She also discouraged calling county authorities, claiming the HOA was handling the matter. Her words were tragically misguided. On the third day of the deluge, the creek overflowed. Streets turned into canals, the sewers overwhelmed. Several families found themselves stranded, water creeping into basements, vehicles half submerged. Panicked phone calls to emergency services soared. When I returned to Willow Creek Ridge that evening, I was stunned at the scale. The lower part of the neighborhood was already partially underwater. Fire department rescue vehicles roamed, and a few canoes were ferrying people from their flooded homes. I raced to my house, relieved to find Amanda safe, though the water had encroached onto our back patio. The sky was still gray, and more rain threatened. This was nowhere close to over. That night, I put my professional hat on. Though the neighborhood didn't know it yet, I was more than just an emergency logistics worker. I was FEMA's chief of emergency logistics for the Midwest region. Normally, I coordinated major relief operations from a high-level vantage point, but now the disaster was literally at my doorstep. My first step was to contact my FEMA colleagues, who confirmed that the county had requested federal assistance. Plans were already in motion to set up relief supply stations in strategic locations around the region, distribution points for bottled water, non-perishable food, medical supplies, and temporary shelters. Due to my personal knowledge of Willow Creek Ridge, I recommended establishing a small supply center on higher ground near the center of our neighborhood. The county was receptive, especially since getting supplies to those cut off by floodwaters was essential. Early next morning, large trucks loaded with relief materials arrived at a designated lot near the Willow Creek Ridge Community Center. Volunteers started constructing makeshift tents to shelter the supplies from the elements. We had cots, blankets, water filters, portable generators, everything to help families endure the flooding and recover afterward. Local media covered the scene. Many neighborhood residents came out to volunteer, including John O'Malley, who was overjoyed to see a real rescue effort. But among the crowd, I spotted Karen, standing at a distance in her Mercedes, staring through the windshield with a deep scowl. A sinking feeling told me she wasn't happy about an external entity taking charge. For someone so used to absolute control, the presence of FEMA trucks in her neighborhood must have felt like an invasion. By midday, rumors spread that Karen was behind a series of complaints to the local zoning board, attempting to shut down the FEMA supply station. She claimed that the trucks violated noise ordinances, that the relief tents were temporary structures erected without the HOA's design approval, and that large crowds might damage the grass. At first, the volunteers laughed it off. Surely no official would prioritize grass over flood relief. But Karen had connections, and the rumor was that some local officials were uncertain how to proceed. Willow Creek Ridge was technically under the HOA's purview, and while federal law could override local restrictions during emergencies, bureaucratic red tape sometimes took time to cut through. Sensing the need to handle this carefully, I approached Karen directly that afternoon. She sat in her SUV, engine idling, watching as volunteers unloaded another pallet of water jugs. Rolling down her window an inch, she fixed me with a stony glare. Me. Karen, we need to talk. The community is experiencing a serious flood crisis. People's homes are underwater, and FEMA is here at the county's request to provide relief. Why are you trying to shut us down? Karen, icily, you outsiders barged in without consulting the HOA. There's a right way to do things. All structures must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee, and the noise from trucks is disturbing residents. I've received numerous complaints. Me. I understand the neighborhood's aesthetic concerns matter under normal circumstances, but this is an emergency. We're talking about saving lives, preventing illness, delivering essential supplies. Any noise or disruption is temporary. The sooner we can help, the faster we can pack up and leave. Karen's lips tightened. My job is to maintain Willow Creek Ridge's standards. Besides, I don't see why you need so many supplies. The flooding isn't that bad. I studied her face, a mixture of denial and resentment. It's that bad for those whose homes are submerged. And you should know I'm not just a random volunteer. I work. Before I could explain my role in FEMA, she raised the window and drove off, ignoring me. I stood there, anger simmering. This was bigger than mere compliance. Her ego could cost people dearly if she succeeded in hampering relief operations. In the following days, the sabotage went from bureaucratic grumbling to overt interference. Volunteers noticed that some of our supply pallets were mysteriously relocated or covered with "No trespassing" signs overnight. The Municipal Water Authority received a complaint that the supply station's water tanks were polluting the local environment. Meanwhile, the generator's wiring was tampered with, nearly causing a fire hazard before a vigilant volunteer discovered the sabotage. We had no proof that Karen herself carried out these acts, but the pattern was suspicious. Each incident targeted relief items specifically, never standard property around the neighborhood. When we tried to install a second tent for medical checks, we found the site roped off by brand new caution tape, with a sign reading, HOA property, keep out unless authorized. Given these alarming developments, I gathered the volunteers and the local county liaison for a meeting. We concluded that we needed tighter security around the relief station, possibly even local police oversight. I also contacted FEMA's legal branch to clarify the protocol. It turned out the Stafford Act, federal emergency management legislation, generally overrides HOAs in declared disaster zones, but we needed county law enforcement to stand firm. At the same time, the floodwaters showed no sign of receding. More storms loomed in the forecast. Our supply center was crucial. Families were relying on bottled water after contaminants leaked into the municipal supply, and some used the makeshift medical station for basic care. Shutting it down or slowing it would be catastrophic. And so the stage was set for a clash. Karen, brandishing her so-called authority, and our official relief operation. She still had no clue of my senior standing in FEMA, though I suspected she'd soon discover just how powerless her HOA rules were against federal emergency mandates. Despite the clear need for collaboration, Karen found allies in a small group of residents. Some believed her propaganda that the FEMA station was ruining property values by attracting outsiders. Others felt uncertain about the future, clinging to the familiar face of their HOA president, hoping she'd maintain some illusion of normalcy. When the county sheriff's department tried to intervene by placing an officer on site for security, Karen personally arrived with an attorney friend, brandishing documents that claimed the HOA had final say on common areas. She threatened a lawsuit if the county didn't remove its officer. This led to a standoff. The sheriff's office escalated to the county commissioner, who escalated to the state emergency management department, and so on. It became a swirl of bureaucratic confrontation at the worst possible time. Meanwhile, families were lining up daily for supplies, worried about the next storm. My phone rang nonstop with calls from colleagues coordinating larger relief efforts across the region. We had entire towns downstream at risk of catastrophic flooding. Resources were spread thin, and I needed to ensure Willow Creek Ridge's station stayed functional without draining attention from the bigger crisis. Amanda and John O'Malley joined me in quietly pushing back. They organized volunteer teams to guard supplies at night. They posted watch shifts to catch potential saboteurs. If the HOA or any of its stooges tried to meddle, we'd be ready. But none of us expected the next sabotage to be so blatant or so destructive. On a misty morning, just as dawn broke, I arrived at the relief station for my usual check-in. My stomach plummeted at the sight. The chain-link fence around the main supply tent had been cut open, and dozens of pallets lay toppled or slashed. Plastic-wrapped water cases spilled across the muddy ground, their contents ruined. Medical kits had been tossed and torn, scattering bandages, gauze, and medicine. Part of the canvas roof was sliced, letting drizzle soak the interior. Volunteers stood around in shock, heartbreak etched on their faces. John knelt by a box of ruined baby formula, shaking his head in disbelief. "Who would do this?" he muttered, voice trembling with anger. It was a staggering blow. The supplies that had taken precious time and resources to gather were either stolen or destroyed, rendering them useless. This was no casual act of vandalism. Someone had gone to great lengths to sabotage our relief hub. It reeked of methodical malice. I called the sheriff immediately. Deputies arrived to take photographs and statements. The question on everyone's mind was the same. Had Karen orchestrated this, or was it some radical minion acting in her name? Her attorney had threatened legal action, but would she really stoop to direct sabotage, an act that could endanger entire families? Grimly, I noted we had backups in the pipeline. Additional trucks would be arriving in the coming days, but time was critical. People needed water now. This destruction set us back at least a day, maybe more, risking serious health consequences. FEMA's regional command stepped in, determined to replace the lost supplies as quickly as possible. They also agreed to dispatch a few federal security personnel to guard the station, something rarely done outside of high-crisis zones. This response hammered home the seriousness of the sabotage. We had an active relief site under threat. Behind my anger lay a fierce resolve. In all my years dealing with hurricanes, wildfires, and tornadoes, I'd seen heartbreak and tragedy, but rarely had I seen willful sabotage from within a community that needed help. I vowed privately that whoever was responsible would answer for it, no matter their position in an HOA. That afternoon, I convened an impromptu neighborhood meeting near the battered relief center. I invited local residents to see the damage firsthand, to understand that this act of vandalism wasn't just an abstract assault on some faceless agency. It hurt their neighbors, their children. Amid the crowd, I spotted Karen lurking near the back, arms crossed over her tailored blazer, eyes narrowed. She hadn't said a word since the sabotage. Perhaps she was gauging the sentiment, waiting for an opportunity to spin events in her favor. I stood on a small crate to address everyone. "Friends, neighbors, my name is Lucas Reed, and I realize some of you only know me as the new guy who works in emergency management. But I need you to understand something. I'm not just a volunteer. I am actually Chief of Emergency Logistics for FEMA in this region. By destroying these supplies, someone has committed a federal crime, obstructing emergency relief efforts during a declared disaster. This is a serious offense that endangers lives. We have local families depending on clean water and medical assistance. I promise you, we will find and prosecute whoever is responsible." A shocked murmur spread through the crowd. They glanced from me to the ruined tents, then back to me. Some looked at Karen, whose face froze. She was clearly rattled by the revelation of my high-level position. If she had relied on intimidation before, she now faced a far more formidable adversary than an average homeowner. As I stepped down, a wave of questions from neighbors followed. Did we have leads on the culprit? How soon would new supplies arrive? Would the station remain open despite the sabotage? I reassured them that FEMA had contingencies for these situations and that replacements were en route. Karen remained silent, but the tension rolling off her was palpable. I couldn't say yet if she'd personally ordered the sabotage, but there was no doubt she was complicit in trying to shut down our operations. Now that she knew who I was, it would be interesting to see if she dared escalate her interference further, or if she would back off. The sheriff's department, aided by county investigators, took the lead on the vandalism case. They had reason to suspect that someone local was involved, especially given the precision with which our supply hub was targeted. Security footage was limited. An overnight camera had been conveniently disabled before the break-in, but the investigators found footprints, a partial shoe imprint in the mud, and some fabric caught on the fence. They also took note of suspicious tire tracks near the edge of the property, though the mud had partially obscured them. A few residents came forward anonymously, stating that they'd overheard Karen complaining about the eyesore FEMA tents, calling them an affront to everything Willow Creek Ridge stands for. One even claimed that Karen bragged about having connections who could put an end to that fiasco. But hearsay wasn't proof. The investigators needed direct evidence tying her or her associates to the crime. Meanwhile, we scrambled to rebuild. Additional staff from FEMA security arrived, placing a guard at the site around the clock. Volunteers resumed distribution of what few supplies remained intact, supplementing with quickly donated resources from local businesses. By now, The county roads had partially reopened, though flooding persisted in certain low-lying areas. Many homes had water damage. Mold was a growing concern. The relief station functioned as a lifeline for people in Willow Creek Ridge and neighboring communities. Despite Karen's hostility, we served everyone, HOA rules or not. In a brief moment of calm, I found myself reflecting on Karen's possible motivations. Why sabotage relief efforts that so clearly benefited her own neighborhood? My best guess, control. She disliked any force or authority rivaling her. In her twisted mind, a large-scale flood response overshadowed her petty regulations, undermining her authority. Perhaps she feared that once residents saw how real leadership functioned, they'd question her draconian hold on the community. Little did she know that tampering with federal emergency efforts is not just a bigger stage, it's a bigger hammer. If found guilty, she could be staring at serious prison time. About a week after the sabotage, I received a call from a blocked number. The voice on the other end was shaky, clearly modulated to disguise identity. Mr. Reed, I'm someone close to Karen Montclair. I can't reveal my name, but I need to tell you something important. The sabotage was planned at Karen's house with 2 men from outside the neighborhood. She arranged for them to break in, cut open the fencing, and destroy as much as they could. She paid them off using HOA funds she diverted for community beautification. I'm sorry I can't say more, but I couldn't keep this secret any longer. Then the line went dead. Adrenaline coursed through me. If true, this was the smoking gun we needed, a direct link between Karen and the sabotage. But an anonymous tip alone wouldn't hold up in court. We needed verifiable evidence, financial records, surveillance, or confessions. I immediately contacted the county sheriff, who confirmed a detective was on the case. They'd discreetly check into the HOA's financial transactions to see if any beautification line items matched suspicious payouts. They also wanted more digital footprints, perhaps from email correspondences. If Karen had orchestrated the sabotage, she might have left a trail. That night, as I lay in bed, the reality sank in. We were facing an enemy from within. This wasn't just a petty neighbor dispute. Karen had risked thousands of lives by destroying resources essential for flood victims. She weaponized her position to hinder a federal relief program. If we could prove it, she'd face prison, and I vowed to see it through, for the sake of all the families she had hurt. With each passing day, the floodwaters receded slowly, revealing the true extent of the damage to roads, homes, and personal belongings. The relief station, rebuilt and restocked, continued operating at full capacity. Morale among volunteers lifted slightly because we were making progress. But Karen, cornered by rumors of an official investigation, grew more brazen. She roamed the neighborhood, distributing flyers warning residents that FEMA's presence could lead to the seizure of private property. The claims were preposterous. FEMA doesn't seize private property under normal circumstances. Yet some gullible residents panicked, rushing to Karen in search of guidance. She stirred fear to maintain her grip. Her final strike came when she attempted to forcibly close the supply station by lodging a civil complaint in court. She alleged that the station violated Willow Creek Ridge's residential zoning, the same argument she tried earlier, but this time with a well-paid attorney. She demanded a temporary restraining order to halt all relief operations. For a tense 48 hours, the court scheduled a hearing to consider whether the supply station could remain. If the judge sided with Karen, we'd be legally compelled to shut down or relocate, a disastrous scenario for all those who depended on that site for clean water and food. County officials scrambled to defend the station, citing the emergency. I prepared documentation showing the critical services provided, the health risks if the station closed, and the federal legal basis for operating in a declared disaster area. The hearing loomed as a showdown, a bizarre reflection of how far Karen would go to stoke her own power at the expense of the community's well-being. The hearing took place at the local courthouse on a rainy morning, the sky still moody from weeks of storms. A modest crowd of Willow Creek Ridge residents gathered in the gallery, many wearing expressions of worry or anger. On one side sat Karen, flanked by her attorney. On the other side, I sat with the county's legal representative and an assistant from FEMA. The judge, an older gentleman named Judge Calhoun, opened proceedings by summarizing Karen's complaint that the FEMA supply station was erected without appropriate permits, violated HOA covenants, and posed a nuisance to residents. She requested an immediate injunction to cease all operations. Karen's attorney presented the argument that the station was an overreach, ignoring local authority and damaging the community's property values. He tried to paint a picture of constant noise, traffic jams, and alleged pollution. Then it was the defense's turn. The county lawyer explained that public safety superseded HOA restrictions in a declared disaster. FEMA's assistant outlined that the Stafford Act empowered federal agencies to establish relief sites without local permission when urgent. I testified about the direct harm to residents if the site closed: lack of potable water, increased risk of disease, slower recovery. I also referenced the sabotage, highlighting how essential supplies had already been destroyed. When Karen had the chance to speak, she launched into a tirade. "Your Honor, we can't let these outsiders override our carefully maintained neighborhood standards. The flooding was never so severe as they claim. My residents are terrified by the chaos of trucks and rations scattered everywhere. Surely a better solution exists than turning Willow Creek Ridge into a refugee camp." The judge listened with a poker face. Then, in a calm tone, he said, "Ms. Montclair, we're in the middle of a substantial flood crisis, with widespread damage across the region. My understanding is that hundreds of families rely on this relief station. Are you suggesting we simply let them fend for themselves because you find it unsightly?" Karen tried to backtrack, but her arrogance shone through. She insisted that if the station must continue, it should be moved outside Willow Creek Ridge. At that moment, the county investigator rose and politely asked the judge if he could present some late-breaking evidence. Judge Calhoun allowed it. The investigator provided documented proof of suspicious financial transfers from the HOA's beautification budget to an unnamed entity, matching the timeline of the sabotage. He explained they were part of an ongoing criminal investigation. Karen's face went pale. The courtroom buzzed as the investigator concluded, "We have strong reason to believe Ms. Montclair financed criminal acts to destroy FEMA supplies. This underscores how vital those supplies are, and how unscrupulous the effort to remove them." Judge Calhoun frowned deeply at Karen. Then he ruled that the relief station had a legitimate right to operate under emergency law, and he denied her request for an injunction. The station would remain open. Karen's final legal weapon to evict us had failed. With the hearing behind us, the county's criminal investigation kicked into high gear. They subpoenaed HOA financial records going back 2 years, discovering multiple irregularities. Karen had authorized large checks to a shell landscaping company that never seemed to do any actual landscaping. Further scrutiny revealed the names of 2 men with records of petty theft and vandalism, who had apparently received payments from the same account around the time of the sabotage. When confronted by detectives, these men confessed they were paid to rough up the FEMA station. They claimed they'd never expected it to be such a big deal. Karen had allegedly told them it was a minor vandalism job to disrupt an illegal occupation of neighborhood land. The confessions were taped, forming a devastating chain of evidence against Karen. One morning, news broke that Karen Montclair had been arrested on charges of felony vandalism, conspiracy to commit criminal mischief, and interfering with federal emergency operations. The latter charge carried severe penalties, especially under disaster statutes. They led her away from her immaculate home in handcuffs, much to the shock and, for many, the relief of the neighborhood. Local media swarmed. Journalists reported how the powerful HOA president had fallen from grace by allegedly orchestrating sabotage against her own community during a flood crisis. Her attorney tried to paint it as a misunderstanding, but the evidence was too damning. The entire city watched, aghast, as a petty tyrant faced justice for endangering the vulnerable. With Karen in custody awaiting trial, the atmosphere in Willow Creek Ridge changed overnight. The rumor mill churned, yes, but relief replaced fear. People felt they could breathe without the threat of random fines or malicious interference. The HOA board, in disarray, hastily appointed an interim president who publicly apologized for not stopping Karen sooner. Some members admitted they'd been pressured or blackmailed by her behind the scenes. Meanwhile, I oversaw the continuing flood relief efforts. We established a more permanent supply line. The waters were receding enough that families could start returning to salvage what was left of their homes. My FEMA colleagues coordinated with local and state entities to assess damage, hand out grants, and connect people with resources for rebuilding. The big question on everyone's lips: what would become of Karen's property and position? Rumors suggested the HOA was about to remove her officially, but that hardly mattered if she landed in prison. Also, the sabotage charges carried weighty financial consequences. She might have to forfeit assets to cover restitution to FEMA and homeowners impacted by the destroyed supplies. I felt a sense of righteous satisfaction that justice was in motion, but also sadness that one person's lust for control had cost so much. In my line of work, I had witnessed devastating hurricanes, tornadoes, and wildfires, all acts of nature. But seeing a fellow human sabotage relief for her own neighbors was a new depth of cynicism. If anything, it steeled my resolve to keep doing what I did, coordinating help for those in dire need. Karen's trial began 3 months later, once the floodwaters were long gone, but the scars remained. The courthouse brimmed with spectators, reporters, local residents, and even some who had relocated from the flooded areas. They wanted to see justice served. The prosecution laid out the evidence meticulously. They showed the bank transfers from the HOA account to the shell landscaping firm, the subsequent cash withdrawals that landed in the saboteurs' hands. They played audio recordings of the men confessing Karen had hired them to destroy as much as possible at the FEMA site. They also presented testimonies from neighbors who had heard Karen rant about wanting the relief station gone. I was called to testify about the station's critical role, the sabotage's impact, and the broader ramifications for public safety. A hush fell over the courtroom as I described families going without safe water, the risk of disease and flood conditions, and how the targeted attack delayed distribution of life-saving aid. Karen's defense tried to claim she was protecting the neighborhood, that the sabotage was an unfortunate misunderstanding. But cross-examination revealed she had zero evidence that the FEMA station was illegal. Her claims about lost property values paled compared to the real suffering of flood victims. In her final statement, Karen half-heartedly apologized for any confusion, but maintained she never intended for it to go so far. The jury, unimpressed, deliberated for a single afternoon. Their verdict: guilty on all counts, felony conspiracy, vandalism, and interference with federal emergency operations. The maximum sentence loomed. At the sentencing hearing, the judge delivered a scathing rebuke. Ms. Montclair, your actions not only violated the trust of your neighbors, but also egregiously endangered lives during a natural disaster. This court cannot overlook the severity of conspiring to destroy essential relief supplies. Such conduct is unconscionable. She was sentenced to several years in prison. Additionally, the court ordered restitution to both FEMA and to the Willow Creek Ridge residents who faced harm due to her sabotage. The sums involved were enormous. In a dramatic twist, her personal assets, including her house and significant funds from her bank accounts, were seized to fulfill the restitution order. The HOA itself faced scrutiny for failing to hold her accountable sooner, but the legal blame lay primarily on Karen. The day deputies arrived at her once pristine home to catalog valuables and place it under lien, a small crowd gathered quietly outside. Some were neighbors, not celebrating her downfall, but relieved that a reign of terror had ended. The door that once displayed an imperious HOA president plaque stood wide open, the symbol of her power undone by her own hubris. Life in Willow Creek Ridge slowly returned to normal, or, rather, found a better normal. The post-flood recovery was extensive. Homes underwent mold remediation, roads required repair, and families restocked lost furniture. But with the FEMA station's support and county assistance, the neighborhood rebuilt in unity. A new HOA board was elected, comprised of residents who actually valued cooperation and empathy. They revised the covenant rules to allow for emergency preparedness measures, including an official plan for floods or other disasters. Neighbors who once lived in fear of Karen's fines began to share resources, hold block parties, and collaborate on yard projects. The wetlands behind our house gradually returned to their serene state, brimming with renewed bird life. I found that Willow Creek Ridge, now free of Karen's oppression, was a place where people genuinely cared for one another. Yes, it took a crisis of unprecedented flooding and the exposure of a criminal saboteur for the neighborhood to discover its collective strength. Months passed. Karen Montclair languished in prison, stripped of her ill-gotten power and prestige. The property she had clung to was auctioned off to partially cover her massive restitution debts. Rumors circulated that she wrote bitter letters from her cell, blaming others for her downfall, refusing to accept responsibility. But her day in the spotlight was over. Meanwhile, I remained at Willow Creek Ridge, continuing my work with FEMA on a broader scale. Every time I passed the area where our relief station once stood, now a grassy field once more, I felt a pang of recollection, remembering the tension, the sabotage, and the heroic volunteer spirit that ultimately prevailed. Neighborhood life moved on, shaped by the memory of a near catastrophe and the downfall of an egomaniacal HOA tyrant. If there was a silver lining, it was that the community discovered its own resilience in the face of both natural disaster and human malice. People learned that looking out for one another beats appeasing any self-anointed despot. As for me, I returned to my quieter routine, grateful that I could protect my neighbors in their time of need, and reaffirm my core belief that, in the final reckoning, real compassion and unity overcome the schemes of any single Karen. We had proven it, under the worst possible circumstances, and emerged stronger on the other side.